Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the second day of the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium. Our first presentation will be by Curtis Milhaupt. His presentation is titled Corporate Governance in an Era of Geoeconomics.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. I thought I would be talking to myself this morning at 9 a.m. Regrettably, I don't have any. This seems very loud, by the way. Maybe we turn the volume down a little bit. It seems rather loud. I don't have any dad jokes or poetry or even a cocktail recipe for you this morning. I have the first part of what I hope is a larger project on how corporations are adapting to the new geoeconomic or geopolitical environment. And this was, to some extent, it's a follow-on the project I did on the geopolitics of controlling shareholders. This particular paper was inspired by the second quotation here by this DOJ official. And I think what he said is quite right, that private companies are on the front lines of national security and geopolitical challenges today. And I thought, that's right. And these are private, profit-oriented organizations. They're not organizationally well suited to playing this role as instruments of national security and geopolitics. They both are recipients of pressures from governments to restrict technology transfers and the like. But on the other hand, they're also very important players in their own right. Think about NVIDIA, TSMC, Starlink. These are critically important players for governments in economic and national security. So the two questions I'm interested in is how's the legal and policy environment for corporate governance changing as a result of this environment, and how are U.S. companies adapting to the new environment? Obviously, this environment affects companies around the world, including in Europe, who are to some extent caught in the middle between the United States and China. I think I've made in this project, in this paper, a little bit of headway in thinking about the first question. I confess I've not made much headway in the second. Hopefully, I have at least a kind of roadmap or list of things that might be fodder for more rigorous follow-on. But I'm finding it challenging to actually find out what's happening in the boardroom. Very quickly, just by way of wind-up, in the interest of time, I won't spend much time on this, but I went back, just to motivate the paper, I went back to the three really prevalent lines of scholarship that were in play around the time that I became an academic, around the turn of the 21st century. Everyone in the room is familiar with these literatures. What was interesting going back in hindsight was how thoroughly infused these literatures are with the spirit of optimism about globalization. And there isn't even a hint in these literatures that national security concerns or geopolitical rivalries could stand in the way of free movement of capital, free movement of law or transplantation of law in the case of the law and finance literature, or stand in the way of convergence on a US-oriented shareholder primacy model. Obviously, it's not a criticism of the literature. This is with the benefit of hindsight. But it is really striking to go back and look at it in the light of what's going on. I like this quotation. I think throughout history, folks have focused on the benefits of global economic interdependence and downplayed the risk. As I think infamously reflected in Norman Engel's book, The Great Illusion, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the idea that economic interdependence will make conflict, will make war obsolete. And you see the publication date, 1910, just on the eve of the First World War. Okay, so again, just by way of wind-up, quickly, how did we get, so the end of history has come to a very messy conclusion. How did we get here? Focusing on the US-China dynamic, so I think there was rising skepticism of China's embrace of the international order coming out of a session of the WTO. This skepticism increased with the rise of Xi Jinping and his securitization of economic growth. So I think for Xi, economic growth is no longer important for its own sake. It's important for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and this has prompted counter-securitization of the China risk in the United States with this explosion of rules and executive orders and the like that are restraining trade and contact tech transfer with China. And this, of course, has prompted a tit-for-tat response by China, including most recently restrictions on critical rare earth exports to the United States. Okay, so what's happening? Just as a way of gauging, just kind of informally, just getting a sense of how this affected the risk profile of companies, I went back and looked at 20-some years of risk factors in 10Ks, and I've got some other slides or other graphs in the paper, but you see this huge spike in mentions of geopolitical risk, compliance risk, supply chain vulnerability. Actually, looking at supply chain vulnerability is interesting. There's virtually zero mentions of this risk in around early 2005. It goes up gradually, and then of course COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, it just skyrockets from there. And this heightened perception of risk is consistent with and corroborated by lots of survey evidence that's out there suggesting that geopolitical risk is either at the top or one of the top risks that is facing companies. Okay, so getting to some headway on the first question, I think it's instructive to think about the current environment as ESG plus G, and to think about the parallels and differences between the two movements. So in parallel, in both cases you have concern for externalities and the impact of corporate activity on stakeholders. In the case of geoeconomics, the externality is geopolitical risk. And the government itself, the state, is a key stakeholder in many corporations. I was just in a conference in Finland, and very tiny economy, and the head of something called the Strategic Supply Agency said that they've identified 2,000 Finnish companies that are considered to be critical for Finland's economic and national security. Imagine in an economy the size of the United States what that number is. So I think in both cases you have this concern for stakeholders. There's some overlap. Obviously, better climate is good for business in the long run. Obviously, peace and stable geopolitical environment is good for business, but this is very costly for businesses to internalize this. In the case of geopolitics, having entire markets shut off, transfer restrictions on tech, et cetera, very costly for companies. Key differences, though, as I alluded to before, in the case of ESG, the government could unilaterally do a lot of the stuff that the ESG movement is trying to do. It could impose cap and trade, et cetera. It could mandate gender equality, et cetera. It's not doing that, and so ESG movement is trying to fill the space. In the case of geopolitics, the government is really dependent on the private sector for technology, et cetera, that is the key to economic and national security. And I think that that's very important in thinking about how this might affect corporate governance going forward. So how will companies adapt? Again, just a first broad brush look at this. I looked at board expertise. I looked at international experience of independent directors over the last 6 years. You see a steady increase. On the other hand, if you might think that government or military background would be a useful background for dealing with today's geopolitical environment, we actually see declining percentage there. So I think boards face a kind of make or buy decision with respect to geopolitical expertise. I also looked over the same time period, 2018 to 24, what do companies report about where management or oversight of geopolitical risk is centered within the corporation? What I found is that only 154 of the of the Russell 3000 companies, so 5%, say anything at all about where geopolitical risk is monitored. The ones that do largely say it's centered in the board or some combination of the board, which seems appropriate. Compliance doesn't seem like a particularly appropriate place to locate this. The audit committee. Audit committees have a lot of work on their plate already. This seems like also probably not the right place to center this. But again, the key point here that I was struck by was how few companies are saying anything about this. One would think that investors would want to know where geopolitical risk is being overseen and managed today. Even those companies that say where this function is located say literally nothing about how geopolitical risk is managed, whether through tabletop exercises, the use of technology, et cetera. Complete radio silence on that. Yesterday we talked about ESG compensation. 30 of the Russell 3000 companies say that the comp committee takes into account the geopolitical environment in assessing the CEO. But again, they say absolutely nothing about how that's done. So this is the softest of soft metrics. Okay, well, the question I think we really want to get at is how, what's going to happen beyond this? How will enterprises adapt? I don't have time to go through all this. The compliance function has obviously been heightened given all of the economic sanctions and tech transfer restrictions, et cetera. Arnold and Porter put out a memo that says every U.S. company should realize that every business decision they make is now going to be scrutinized through a national security lens. Supply chain management we talked about. This is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of companies dealing with geopolitical issues. The Biden administration made supply chain resilience a high policy priority. There was some movement toward coordinating supply chains among like-minded countries. I suspect that under Trump that has fallen by the wayside. Securities risk disclosures, I think we'll see litigation over misleading or lack of disclosure, geopolitical washing, if you will, failure to disclose adequately, vulnerabilities in supply chains and the like. And then finally, just based on conversations in Silicon Valley, this has really ramped up emphasis on government relations and lobbying. So if you think just about Trump's Golden Dome project, government's going to let out $150 billion of contracts, and this is bringing out of the woodwork tech startups that in the past, were not originally focused on defense. And so this is moving well beyond the usual suspects here. So just to return, the return of history in corporate governance, what does this mean? If we just go back to the key focuses of the literature, listing, shareholding, and governance, we've moved from open markets to national security screening. So the public capital markets today are no longer politically neutral financing infrastructure. They have become a tool of geopolitical screening. They become very values inflected. Shein is a good example of this. So it's been searching for a home for its IPO. This is the fast fashion retailer. Tried to list in New York. That was shut down by congressmen complaining about alleged forced labor in its supply chain. It was set after some controversy in London. It was set to list here. And just recently, the Chinese government denied its permission to list in London. So it will wind up listing in Hong Kong. Shareholding, if you go back to the law and finance literature, the only dependent variable here was dispersed versus concentrated ownership. The identity of shareholders was irrelevant in that literature. Today we have identity-based scrutiny of shareholders. Corporate identity is a contested term today, as epitomized by the TikTok statute, which Dan and I have a blog post on this in the Harvard Forum. The statute simply blows through all of the standard corporate definitions of corporate personality, corporate control, et cetera, and simply declares that TikTok is controlled by a foreign adversary. And then finally, in governance, we've moved from a sense of converging on shareholder primacy to, I'm not sure what, maybe some sort of values-based convergence, perhaps, but one thing is for sure, certainly more state-influenced corporate governance, again, as illustrated by the golden share that the U.S. is taking in U.S. Steel. So just finally, final points here, as a kind of research agenda going forward, should corporate law evolve to take account of new concepts of corporate identity and definitions of control? I doubt that it will, but what this means is that I think increasingly these corporate law concepts are going to be simply overridden by overtly political measures of identity and control. We talked yesterday about caremark liability in the ESG context. Question mark whether it will also be used for geopolitical trauma. Again, if you think about, say, the collapse of a supply chain, might boards be held liable for that? This does not seem like an ordinary business risk of the sort that the Chancery Court had said is not susceptible to caremark challenges. So we'll see what happens there. Implication for raising capital, again, we're seeing the politicization of the public capital markets, and so maybe this will push even more firms to the private markets. And then at the firm level, again, key question I'd like to get at is what's happening in the boardroom. I've had some informal conversations with folks, but I would love suggestions for how to get at this more systematically, and in particular, what's the role of technology, and will AI come to the rescue of boards in trying to oversee this very complex geopolitical environment? Okay, so that's the project as it stands. Thanks very much. I look forward to your comments.
All right, Jill Fisch.
Okay, so thanks everybody for showing up so early, and Curtis, thanks for this paper. I feel poorly equipped. It's a very sophisticated paper. I learned a lot, but I also felt like I really had to sort of stretch even to think about all the hard concepts that Curtis has put on the table. And I think this whole research agenda is going to be incredibly valuable in the real world. I mean, I can just imagine, if there were a bunch of directors in the room listening to this presentation, they would be like, okay, Curtis, next week you're going to come in and talk to our board and our CEO because this stuff really matters. And of course, it's great to be doing a corporate law paper that really matters. Overview. Part of the reason I struggled is, the paper's about geoeconomics, and I'm like, what is that? This is a definition of geoeconomics that Curtis uses in the paper, and as you see, I'm going to drill down just a little bit in terms of what exactly is distinctive about geoeconomics, right? But that's kind of our starting point if, like me, you're kind of new to this space. Basically, what he's saying, I think the sort of really profound takeaway is the idea that governments, countries are using private, profit-oriented enterprises as a tool in political power, right? I think that's really, if you had to distill it, and it's a lot to distill, right? But if you had to distill it to one core, that's what it is, right? And of course, corporations may not be prepared for that. And so how should this new risk impact corporate governance, right? So that's, I think, not exactly the way Curtis presented it, but that's my naive take on the paper, right? So key contributions, right? Documenting all of this, suggesting the impact this has for corporate law scholars in terms of shifts away from two big kind of what we've all thought of as universal truths, right? Globalization and shareholder primacy, and identifying very practical some of the ways that U.S. corporations should respond, right? So I'm going to skip over because there's a huge amount of detail here and even more that you could do. I'm going to just kind of list the tangible response recommendations. One, understanding the government and the government as a stakeholder. So we had a bunch on ESG yesterday, right? So the government, you add them to that list of possible stakeholders. The need in dealing with these risks for geopolitical or geoeconomic expertise within the corporation, liability exposure under Caremark, and I have to say here, I was skeptical, Roy, yesterday about Caremark in your paper. I'm skeptical about Caremark here. I mean, I think it's totally fair to just flag it as a possibility, but I wouldn't, if I were a director, be overly worried about personal liability under Caremark. Securities reporting, I think, actually is a bigger risk, and there's a whole literature there. Curtis talks in the paper a little bit about shareholder proposals, and of course, supply chain management, which has been sort of a brewing, festering issue for a long time, right? So a couple of questions for my comments, right? And this is just sort of an overview, right? But here are the things that struck me where at least I thought, Curtis, you could give us a little more discussion, right? So first of all, is this really new? Right? And I was particularly struck, as I said, the paper is really timely. So Robert Gates has something in the Wall Street Journal this morning, an editorial, talking about the use of private industry in political issues. And his view is this dates back to 1949. but we've kind of lost track of it in the last 10 or 20 years. And of course, a lot of the empirical, a lot of the numbers that Curtis is using are pretty recent, right? But you think about sensitive industries and sensitive products, right? Post-World War II, right? There was an emphasis, there was the same sort of relationship, right? And, I cherry-picked a couple of other examples, right? Caterpillar and supply chain issues, climate-related supply chain issues. Again, right? Not something that's just happened in the last couple of years, right? Cross-border transactions are a way that countries have historically protected national interests, and the idea of national interests has been, for a long time, relatively flexible, relatively capacious, right? And of course, we had Jimmy's paper yesterday on China and state-owned enterprises, and that's obviously one way of bringing political considerations into what we might consider private business, right? So that's also a long-standing issue, and China's not the only example of that. Think about government ownership in Volkswagen. But of course, right, I'm overstating the case. Oh, there's really nothing new to see here, right? There is a lot that's new, so I don't want to undersell those observations in Curtis's paper, right? The increasing fusion of what is government policy and what is private business policy, the expansion of what we call national security interests, and TikTok is a great example, and of course, again, in the paper today, Nippon and U.S. Steel, right? Great example, the scope of steel production and the government's willing to intervene in a private merger and sort of micromanage, right? So this is not from today because I couldn't update the slides, but, as I understand, and we're still finding out about the transaction, a lot potentially of government control of what you would think of as private operational decisions, including where we're going to build new plants and so forth, right? So that's the first question. Second question, and Curtis had this slide documenting what's going on, bless you, in China, right? Is this really a China-specific thing? And, right, there's a lot, right? There's a lot more about China kind of than about any other political relationship. But of course, by the way, it's not really China, right? We've got what's going on in the US, the sort of focus on things that are going to affect ordinary business operations with Canada and Mexico, right? Ostensibly to deal with fentanyl, which, so as I understand, that's not kind of a traditional private US corporate issue. But so, it might be useful to sort of think about that and draw more clearly the lines to other countries. Terminology, right? So I kind of struggled with, and you seem to use these terms interchangeably, but I had the sense that there was something a little bit different about geoeconomics as you were using it in the paper, right? And I wanted you to draw that out because I think that's a little bit about what you think is going on that's special here, right? It's also useful, I think, to explain why this is not a traditional issue of national security. What we mean, what counts today, is arguably different, and I think that matters because it means the implications extend to a broader range of for-profit companies and ordinary business decisions, right? It would also be useful because I've thought a lot about domestic political risk, right? The risk of political engagement, the risk of not being politically engaged, right? So what's different about geopolitical risk, and does it matter if a company is thwarting the U.S. government's policy with respect to education in the United States or relationships with China, right? Does that really matter in terms of things like politically aware directors, right? And, political engagement is a double-edged sword. It's a risk, but it's also a tool of risk management. And finally, the impact, right? Drilling down, it's not just political risk, it's isolationism, right? And you stress that at the beginning of the paper, but there's a huge impact of that on customers, on employees, on other non-government stakeholder groups. Yeah, 2 minutes. I'm moving right along here. I'm talking really fast, right? So one of the things that I think is super interesting, and Curtis referred to his blog post with Dan, and I understand that Curtis and Dan have a whole project in progress on this, is this idea of corporate national identity. Because everything that Curtis told you depends on this idea that we can characterize a corporation, right? And therefore we can say, okay, this corporation is a foreign corporation and therefore is a threat to national security. Or this is a domestic corporation and therefore an administration can exercise political power over that corporation. But the whole move to multinational globalization has sort of taken away our ability to characterize in that way, right? So all of these different things could determine a corporation's national identity. Right? Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, right, the implication of identity matters. And we've had a few little forays into that. We've talked about that with respect to capital formation, you know, the idea of, say, Singapore washing, right? Do you list in another country and therefore get more legitimacy? The idea of branding, right? Buy local. And so if you think you're buying from a local corporation, customers are going to be happier, right? Curtis's current project focuses, of course, on regulatory authority and national security's interests, but there's a whole lot of payoff there, right? And of course, at the same time, complicating factors. The ability, just in this story with Shane, of where do you choose to list? Lots of companies that are incorporated in the Cayman Islands. It used to be Israeli companies incorporating in Delaware, right? And what does that do to our idea of identity? All of the tax-related mergers that I don't have time to talk about, but you know, a whole lot of so I think it's certainly worth a separate paper. It's a really interesting project. I think it's something that we all can learn from, right? And there's just a quick picture from your, I stole it from your blog, of the TikTok example, right? So conclusions, yeah, I mean, within time, right? Thought-provoking project, lots of, for us to learn. The implications go beyond, right? This paper stresses the implications for corporate governance, but there's a whole lot more, and at the same time, there's a lot that real decision makers can take away from this project. Thank you.
First up, Luca.
Maybe, John?
Yeah.
John? Maybe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Curtis.
Can I
Sorry.
take just 2 minutes to respond?
Go ahead.
Jill put a lot on the table there. Jill, thanks. Those are great comments, and you put a lot to digest. Let me just respond to a couple of the big things. Is this new? No, it's certainly not entirely new. This is, to some extent, a fancy new term for an old concept. Dutch East India Company was a combination of profit-oriented enterprise and political power. What's distinctive about it today, though, I think, you know, yes, governments have always relied to some extent on the private sector. You know, they need to make steel for battleships, et cetera. I think what's different is the role of technology today and the role of data. I think those things are game changers for the dependence of the government on the private sector. Is this China-specific? Largely, yes, but these are the two largest economies in the world, fundamentally different political systems, at least so far. We seem to be moving toward convergence in some sense. But you know, this has implications for the whole world. And you know, talking to people in Europe who are really caught between between these two. I heard someone say yesterday or a day before at a conference, a European say, we in Europe, we rely for the United States for our defense, Russia for our energy, and China for our technology. So you know, that's a very tough place to be in. Geopolitical risk versus political risk. One thing I forgot to mention, very important point, the distinction between ESG and geoeconomics, bipartisan support in the United States. The China threat is the one and only thing that our politicians can agree upon, and that's really important for thinking about the risk of non-compliance for firms and speaking out. I can't imagine NVIDIA saying, no, we're not going to comply with the tech transfer restrictions on our chips to China, for example. And then finally on corporate identity, yeah, I think this is a big deal. And as I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think one key factor here in thinking about corporate identity today is location of data. That's new, and I think that's really important. So thanks again.
All right, thank you. Luca.
Thank you. Great paper. And I was somewhat surprised not to see you link it to your property writing firm's paper that you know is one of my favorite papers ever, because clearly this must have an impact on ownership structures. So governments take away property rights from firms, basically make business decisions themselves for companies, which, according to the literature, should lead the companies to have a stronger controlling shareholder because they are better able to deal with governments. So I was wondering whether there's any evidence of this already happening, for example, in the terms of the kinds of companies that adopt dual-class shares in the US. It has been technology and media for a long time, and with some exceptions. Defense companies today, you would expect to go public with dual-class shares and so on and so forth. Practically any company actually should do that with the government behaving like it does in the US. So that's one question. And the other question is about institutional investors outside the US, because this industry is dominated by the three big asset managers, or four, and they are everywhere. So again, is something already happening there, or can we expect something to happen in terms of their freedom to go abroad? I think you mentioned that there was some pressure on MSCI to change their indexes with regard to China. But at the same time, I would wonder whether foreign governments may consider companies differently. Even domestic companies may be considered foreign entities because they have BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, etc., as the main shareholders, and that's actually has been the case in Italy with CFIUS controls imposed on a domestic bank trying to take over another bank with the excuse that the main shareholders were U.S. asset managers. So these are
Yeah, thanks, Luca.
Curtis, how about we collect maybe
sure,
three
absolutely.
questions? Okay. Merritt Fox is next, and then Tom Gosling.
Yeah, this is a wonderful paper. I wonder whether there's another dimension to think about. Kind of standard international relations literature puts a big emphasis simply on domestic GDP as a source of national power. And, to some extent, there is a conflict between state interference in the economy in a variety of ways of the kinds that you're talking about, and in essence letting the system flourish in a way that generates a high growth rate and therefore over time a larger GDP. So I think it's worth kind of thinking about whether there's real risks in some sense of government overreach here for the very goal that that we're talking about.
All right, Tom?
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed it. I wonder if there's anything here about where these risks are managed. So if you look at this at the firm level, firms face, radically different, if you just take, US versus China blows up or blows away, right? They're radically different scenarios for the firm. So is the right thing for all of these kind of risks to be managed at the firm level, which requires a level of sort of diversification of supply chains that's massively costly? Or actually investors going to want to view these things more as strategic bets, so that they want different firms to take different views and then they can diversify themselves according to their own preferences? So I just wonder if there's a question about where these types of risks, what level these types of risks get managed at.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, three great questions, Luca. I thought actually about introducing my presentation to say that this kind of goes back to my thinking about this, one of the first papers I ever wrote on property rights in firms. So I think you're right that we should see increasing either government control or influence of corporations, or these firms, these geoeconomically sensitive firms, taking measures to somehow bulk themselves up vis-a-vis the state. I haven't done that research. I think it's interesting. We're starting to see maybe some glimmer of that. I actually had a student write a paper on this very topic, a Japanese student on Japan. He looked at geopolitically important firms in Japan, and he's finding that they are instituting poison pills, dual class, et cetera, to bulk themselves up in exactly the way that this would predict. But that's interesting thing to think about for the future. On institutional investors, I don't know the answer to that. We do see criticism, in the paper, criticism of Vanguard and MSCI for including certain Chinese companies in the indices. Maybe we'll see more of that. So far, I don't think we've seen pressure on the BlackRocks of the world to eliminate Chinese firms, et cetera, from their portfolios, but we'll see. One of the things I'd like to do, and this also resonates with Tom's question, is to understand more how investors are thinking about these questions. I've had just a couple of informal conversations about this topic with folks, an activist investor in particular, who said, gosh, there isn't that much thinking about this topic yet. One would think that will change. And then finally on Merit's point, yeah, absolutely. Tension between government influence over these corporations and economic growth and innovation. I think China is the most, currently acute example of this. So, how long can, China's done great on economic growth, although it's slowing dramatically, and innovation. One wonders how long that can continue with heavy government censorship, what's going to happen to their LLMs, in a system, training in a system with heavy censorship, et cetera. Question marks, I don't know, but I agree, absolutely there's a tension there, and one would think that it's filtering into the United States. Are we going to start taking golden shares in companies as a response to national security concerns for foreign investment? My prediction would be we'll see a golden share in the TikTok case. That will be the solution to the TikTok example. That doesn't seem great from an economic perspective or innovation perspective.
Great. Okay, Renee, and then Roy.
So yeah, this is super interesting. I was struck by the chart, the disclosure chart you had, and I guess I'd just be a little careful about whether that's reflective of increasing risks or just a change in disclosure policy, because I know in 2021, after the DD transaction and they were taken off the exchange right after they went public, there was a really concerted effort to improve the quality of risk disclosures, and so I don't think new risks materialize as much as SEC being very specific through commenting on filings to ensure greater disclosure of risks, and then you would see then with the copy and paste mentality.
Oh, sure.
In the corporate bar, you just see more of that. But I don't think I'm saying anything that's internally sensitive, because there were a number of Dear Issuer letters went out, one on China, one on supply chain and Russia-related risks, and a couple of other topics. So the Dear Issuer letters basically are telling the public the types of comments that we were giving at the SEC at that time on China-related risks, on the risks related to the VEI structure, on risks related to Russia and Ukraine and the supply chain issues. So that uptick is just a reflection of more, not just, but partially a reflection of more comments. And then if you get a comment, you have to respond to it, so you're going to improve the disclosure. And then the other thing I would mention, I didn't hear you talk about today, was just the cybersecurity and how that's such an important geopolitical risk, and the efforts that the SEC is making to provide disclosure. I'm not sure how well it's working out, but to ensure that companies are disclosing what the risks are and their response to it, and to cybersecurity breaches quickly, not 2 or 3 years later.
Right.
Okay, Roy and then Umakant.
Right, so this is related to Renee's first point. So his second question is, how do we examine whether it affects changes in actual board behavior? And you have here the nice angle on board expertise. So you had the slide where you had 2 graphs side by side, and on one side we're seeing a significant increase in supposedly expertise in international relations, but then on the other side we're seeing a graph where no change whatsoever in government and military experience.
Actually declining slightly.
Declines. So that's an indication that the changes is just changes in how they disclose expertise rather than in actual expertise. So this is something that we saw when I did a project with your own, certain types of expertise, when the companies realize that the markets care about them, it's easy to just check the box. I'm a CEO, I had some discussions about international relations, okay, I'm an expert. But if it's government or military, it's not fluff. I cannot say that I have a government or military experience, so it stays steady.
Robin, Umakant.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Jill made about defining geoeconomics or geopolitics. So I was wondering, one way of looking at it is whether it's a material financial risk for the company, and that's something that the board has to consider. And I think we already have examples of that. For example, climate or data breaches. What does it do to the reputation of the company? Does it cause a financial risk to the company? So I think the question is, can we define geoeconomics or geopolitics from that way? Or do we need a paper called The Making and Meaning of Geoeconomics?
Curtis, you have 3 minutes. You want to take a moment to answer or collect?
Yeah, okay, very quickly. Again, great comments. On Renee's point, absolutely. I mean, I'm not trying to make too much of these disclosures. Of course, there's copying, pasting, and copycatting and all that stuff. But, I mean, I think it is reflective of at least a zeitgeist of increased geopolitical risk. And this is really, you know, survey evidence has its problems too, but it's consistent with the feeling and my, you know, informal conversations with folks who say, you know, we live and die with this every day. I mean, I was talking to a board member of a company that makes engines in the marine industry. It operates literally in every country in the world. She said, we literally have to have day-to-day information about everything that is happening around the world. And so, you know, I think that's real. If it's a response to changes in policy of disclosure, why aren't more companies actually saying anything about where this risk is monitored within the firm and how they do it? That strikes me as very puzzling. So it surely doesn't mean that they're not doing it at all. They must be doing it. Why aren't they saying more about that? Roy's point, yeah, similar on disclosure point. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, sure. Now companies need to say that we have this geopolitical expertise. Although even on that front, you don't find much explicit discussion of geopolitical risk, a background. When you read the bios, companies have started to say this person has, you know, background in geopolitical risk. Maybe we'll see more of that in response to responses. But I like your interpretation of these two graphs. Yeah, Umakan, I like that. I like this way of thinking about what geoeconomics is, some kind of material financial risk to the company. So you can write that. You can write that paper.
All right, we have 1 more minute. If you can be very quick, Tobias and Genevieve, we'll let you ask questions, and then Curtis, we'll end it there. Okay.
Really quick. So the way you present this in the paper has a sense of inevitability, and I would question that a little bit because how much of the reactions that we see to the new geopolitical situation has to do with the preferences of a specific administration? Because if you look at DEI, which has nothing to do there, they are definitely very much interfering with corporate affairs. And I'm not sure how much of what you're describing really is a natural consequence of a new geoeconomic situation or just one possible political reaction, and there might be others.
Quickly, Genevieve.
Yes. So in international relations, there is traditionally a tension between the military approach and the diplomatic approach. And perhaps this is something that would be interesting to look at. You know, perhaps no more military on the board, but perhaps, you know, more diplomats. I'm thinking of Nigel Sheinwald, for instance, the former UK ambassador to the US. He became a director at Shell. He's currently a director at Invesco. So, you know, like looking at perhaps talking to people like Chatham House might be interesting to see whether actually, you know, there is a diplomatic presence, which actually would make sense because if you think of Montesquieu's du commerce, you know, actually sort of commercial relationships is perhaps more about talking than fighting.
Okay, we'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.